Welcome to Economics for the IB Diploma. This is Unit 2.2. Today we are going to focus on the fascinating topic of demand. Here we have the learning objectives. You can pause the video and read them now. So the first point is to understand the law of demand and the demand curve. This is going to be our first objective. These 2 points, law of demand and demand curve. Demand is concerned with the behavior of buyers. Consumers or households are buyers of goods and services in product markets, whereas firms or businesses are buyers of factors of production in resource market. Okay, it's important to consider that we as people, as households, as consumers, we buy goods and services. Where? In product markets, because that is a market where we will take the products or services and consume. Companies, on the other hand, they do the same, but they don't buy in product markets. They buy this in resource markets. What does that mean? They buy in the same market, perhaps at a higher level, because they need to use these products to keep selling or transforming. That's why we call them resource markets. In our analysis of demand and supply, we will focus mainly on product markets. Okay? So our focus is going to be on product markets, not on resource markets. Why? Because resource markets, let's suppose, are in the middle of this process. So we want to focus on the end process, product markets. And therefore, that means as a consequence on the behavior of consumers as buyers. Though the same general principles described here also apply to the behavior of firms as buyers in resource markets. It's very similar, but our focus is going to be on product markets. Let's talk about the first point, individual demand. As buyers, consumers are demanders of those items they wish to buy. How can we define demand? The demand of an individual consumer indicates the various quantities of a good or service the consumer is willing and able to buy at different possible prices during a particular time period, ceteris paribus. So here we have the definition of demand. Demand is what consumers want to buy, are expected to buy in regards of quantities of goods and services. And this is obviously at a specific given price. Now, here we have a table. You have an example of the price of chocolate bars and the quantity of chocolate bars demanded per week. In this table, you see that a chocolate bar at the price of 1 has a quantity demanded of 10 bars. So if the price goes up, suppose it goes up to 3, the quantity of bars demanded lowers. So that means it's less. The higher the price, say 5, the quantity demanded is much lower too. So this is what we can get from this. If we plot this information, we can have a graph like this. This graph represents that the higher the price, the less quantity of the good or product, that the good, the product, the service is bought. This is represented in this graph. We have price chocolate bars, the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis, quantity of chocolate bars per week. Now, the second point, we talked about the first point, that is individual demand, inside the law of demand and the demand curve. Now, we need to understand the law of demand and the demand curve. We'll continue with that. Willing means consumer wants to buy the goods. Able means that the consumer can afford to buy it. Everybody may want to buy everything, but we may be willing to buy everything, but we are not able to. So For example, the text tells you, you may want to buy a Ferrari, but can you afford it? Well, if not, your desire to buy one will not show up as demand for Ferraris. Or you can afford a Ferrari, but you have no desire to own one. Again, you will not have any demand for Ferraris. Ceteris paribus means that all things other than price that can affect how much the consumer is willing and able to buy are assumed to be constant and unchanging. We have studied that word, that Greek word, ceteris paribus. Everything remains constant. We are focusing only on price and quantity. So we are not taking into account other factors. That's why we call it ceteris paribus. In fact, the consumer's demand is affected not only by price, but many other things, of course, like income, tastes, and prices of related goods. Right now, for the moment, we ignore all this and concentrate only on the relationship between the quantity of a good and its price. In the graph you saw, on the vertical axis, price, on the horizontal axis, quantity. So these are the only two factors taken into account. Of course, there are many more factors, but we are solely focusing on these two. The next point, the information contained in the demand schedule can be plotted as a graph. Well, I have already shown that in figure 2.1. The price of chocolate bars is plotted, on the vertical axis and then on the horizontal axis. Yes, what you have there is a demand curve. The demand schedule and demand curve do not tell us anything about how many chocolate bars a consumer will actually buy and what price the consumer will pay. This information will be given to us later through the interaction of demand and supply. The demand information only tells us how many chocolate bars a consumer would be prepared to buy. So this is just a preparation. Suppose this pizza, this slice of pizza, it's $5. Okay, I think I can buy 5. Well, it's gonna be double. The price is gonna double. I will not be able to afford 5, perhaps only 2. This is just, again, information about the consumer. What the consumer will be able to buy at these given prices. And well, let's move on to the next point, which is the law of demand. The demand curve plotted in figure 2.1 illustrates a very important relationship, and this is what I have already told you. As the price of a good falls, the quantity of a good demanded increases. So when two variables change in opposite direction, so that as one falls, the other one increases, they are said to have a negative relationship. So the relationship between price and quantity, to analyze the demand, is negative. So this relationship is a causal one. It's a causal relationship because changes in price cause changes in quantity demanded. The negative relationship between price and quantity demanded is known as the law of demand. So, meaning of that, according to the law of demand, there is a negative relationship between the price of a good and its quantity demanded over a particular time period, ceteris paribus. As the price of the good increases, quantity demanded falls. As the price falls, quantity demanded increases, ceteris paribus. You can write down this definition in your cards. Finally, the law of demand is most likely to be consistent with your own experience. The higher the price of a good, the less of it you are probably willing and able to buy. Here we have from individual demand to market demand. We have examples of demand, the curve of demand for one consumer, for another one, and the result the market demanded. Let me read this text. So far, we have considered the demand for a good of one individual consumer. Market demand shows that total quantities in the market for the good consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices. So that means during a particular period of time. Market demand is the sum of all individual demands for that good. This is the example of figure 2.2 that shows how quantity demanded by consumer A is added to the quantity demanded by consumer B, and so on until all the quantities demanded by all consumers of chocolate bars are added up. Well, it's important to know that consumer A has a different demand for chocolate bars than consumer B, indicating different preferences. So the curves are totally different between graph A and graph B. For example, at the price of 4, we add the 4 bars demanded by a consumer A to the 5 bars demanded by consumer B, and so on to all the quantities demanded by other consumers to arrive at the sum of 6,000 chocolate bars per week. The sum is a point on the market demand curve, TM. When we add individual demands in this way for each of the possible prices, we derive the entire market demand curve, DM, showing the total demand in the chocolate bar market. Well, you can see this in the graphs below. Definition of market demand. Market demand is the sum of all individual demands for a good. The market demand curve illustrates the law of demand shown by the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. This is market demand. You can write down this definition. Now, we studied two factors. How quantities increase or decrease depending on one factor. The factor is price. But there are also some variables aside from price. What are these other determinants? What are these non-price determinants? So we're going to focus on factors apart from price. That's why we call this the non-price determinants. The non-price determinants of demand are the variables other than price that can influence demand. They are the variables assumed to be unchanging by use of the ceteris paribus assumption. Changes in the non-price determinants of demand cause shifts in the demand curve. Okay, so remember that in the previous graph, the changes were inside the demand curve. But now changes will happen to be caused by shifts in the demand curve. They might shift to the right or to the left. Let's continue reading. The entire demand curve moves to the right or to the left. In figure 2.3, know that the vertical axis is labeled P, standing for price, and the horizontal axis is labeled Q, standing for quantity. Suppose your regional demand curve is given by D1. If price is P1, then the demand curve D1 indicates the quantity Q1 will be demanded. If the demand curve shifts to the right to D2, at the same price P1, a larger quantity Q2 will be demanded. If, on the other hand, the demand curve shifts to the left from D1 to D3, then a smaller quantity, Q3, will be demanded at the same price 1. So a rightward shift of the demand curve indicates that more is demanded for a given price. Remember that. Rightward shift, that means a shift to the right, more is demanded. Take a look. D2, more is demanded. Q2 is more than Q1. A leftward shift, so that means a shift to the left, indicates that less is demanded for a given price. Look at this, Q3. Q3 is less than Q1. so less is demanded. Okay? So a rightward shift of the curve is called an increase in demand. A leftward shift is called a decrease in demand. All right, so here we have the graph again, indicating the decrease in demand or increase in demand. Now, what are these non-price determinants? Number one, income in the case of normal goods. What is a good? Well, a good is a normal good normally when demand for it increases in response to an increase in consumer income. Demand for the good varies directly with income. Most goods are normal goods. Therefore, an increase in income leads to a rightward shift in the demand curve, and the decrease in income leads to a leftward shift. Example, if people have a higher salary, they will demand more goods. For example, if they buy, suppose they buy bread and they have a low salary, so they have one bread roll for each one. But if the salary increases, they may have two bread rolls for each member of the family. So that's why it increases. Okay, it's important to know an increase in income leads to a rightward shift in the demand curve. So that shift, the curve shifts to the right. Now, what happens if income in the case of inferior goods? It's important to define them. So while most goods are normal, there are some goods where the demand falls as consumer income increases. So the good is then an inferior good. The demand for the good varies inversely with income. What is that? Examples of inferior goods are second-hand clothes, used cars, and bus tickets. As income increases, consumers switch to more expensive alternatives, new clothes instead of second-hand clothes, new cars instead of used cars, aeroplanes rather than traveling by bus. So the demand for the inferior good falls. Thus, an increase in income leads to a leftward shift in the demand curve, and the decrease in income produces a rightward shift. So if the salary of these people who only had one bread roll for each member of the family, obviously, as this is a normal good, they demand more. But these people were having second-hand clothes, but they have a better salary now. They are not going to keep buying second-hand clothes. They will be reducing the quantity of these products and moving on to new ones. So if we focus on second-hand clothes, that means that they are buying less of that. The curve of demand moves to the left. So that means that they buy less of that. Number three, preferences and tastes. If preferences and tastes change in favor of a product, demand increases and the demand curve shifts to the right. If tastes change against the product, demanding decreases and the demand curve shifts to the left. So we might have two options here. That's why many people endorse products. Suppose Lionel Messi advertising a given product. As people follow him, they may change their preferences and tastes and buy more of that product. The same happens if there is a problem with this company, people might buy less of that. Number four, prices of substitute goods. Two goods are substitutes if they satisfy a similar need. An example of substitute goods is Coca-Cola and Pepsi. A fall in the price of one results in a fall in the demand for the other. The reason is that as the price of Coca-Cola falls, some consumers switch from Pepsi to Coca-Cola, and the demand for Pepsi falls. On the other hand, if there is an increase in the price of Coca-Cola, they will result in an increase in the demand for Pepsi, as some consumers switch from Coca-Cola to Pepsi. So therefore, for any two substitute goods, X and Y, a decrease in the price of X produces a leftward shift in the demand for Y, while an increase in the price for X produces a rightward shift in the demand for Y. In brief, in simple, in the case of substitute goods, the price of X and demand for Y change in the same direction. They both increase or they both decrease. Other examples of substitute goods are oranges and apples. So take them as twins. Take them as twins. Coca-Cola and Pepsi are like twins. So if something happens to Coca-Cola, the same happens to the other because they are in the right direction, the same direction. Here the text gives you the example of Cadbury's and Nestle chocolate and milk and yogurt. These are substitute goods. The same happens to both in conclusion. Well, this is number 5 now. Number 5 is prices of complementary goods. Two goods are complementary goods, if they tend to be used together. An example of complementary goods is computers and computer software. In this case, a fall in the price of one, for example, computers, leads to an increase in the demand for the other product, computer software. This is because the fall in the price of computer results in a bigger quantity of computers being purchased, and the demand for computer software increases. Therefore, for any two complementary goods, X and Y, a fall in the price of X leads to a rightward shift in the demand for Y, and an increase in the price of X leads to a leftward shift in the demand for Y. In the case of complementary goods, the price of X and the demand for Y change in opposite direction. As one increases, the other one decreases. More examples of complementary goods are shoes and shoelaces, tennis shoes and tennis rackets, table tennis balls and table tennis rackets. Note that most goods are not related to each other. These are called independent goods. For example, pencils and apples, cars and ice cream, they have no relationship at all. Telephones and books, they are unrelated to one another. And the change in the price of one will have little or no effect on the demand for the other. This is not the case of prices of complementary goods. Okay, the last one would be the number of consumers. If there is an increase in the number of consumers, demand increases, and therefore the market demand curve shifts to the right. If the number of consumers decreases, demand decreases and the curve shifts to the left. This follows simply from the fact that market demand is the sum of all individual demands. Here you have two graphs showing the non-price determinants. In the first graph, you see a movement along the demand curve caused by a change in price. This is the only determinant for this quantity demanded, price. Price changes from point A to point B. So this changes along the curve. Whereas the factors that we have already seen represent a shift of a demand curve. And these are caused by different factors. And we can call these changes in demand. Now, movements along a demand curve and shifts of the demand curve. It's important to distinguish between movements along the demand curve and shift of a demand curve. Whenever the price of a good changes ceteris paribus, it leads to a movement along the demand curve. Figure 2.4a. If the price falls from P1 to P2, the quantity of the good demanded increases from Q1 to Q2. A movement along the demand curve from A to B has occurred. This is referred to as an increase in quantity demanded. An increase in price gives rise to a decrease in quantity demanded, resulting in a movement from B to A. That is quantity affected by price. By contrast, any change in a non-price determinant of demand results in a shift in the entire demand curve. This is example of figure 2.4. This is called change in demand. So don't confuse change in quantity demanded across the curve versus a change in demand. For example, if there is an increase in the number of buyers, the demand curve shifts rightward from D1 to D2. This is called an increase in demand, shown in figure 2.4. A decrease in the number of buyers causes a leftward shift of the demand curve from D1 to D3. This is called a decrease in demand. To summarize, you can write this down. Any change in price produces a change in quantity demanded, shown as a movement on the demand curve. Any change in a non-price determinant of demand leads to a change in demand, represented by a shift of the entire demand curve. Here you have Test Your Understanding 2.2. You have different questions. You can pause the video and do this now. Okay, you've got all the answers for these exercises. You can pause the video and contrast your answers with the ones in here. You can pause the video now. Okay, right now, let's move on to assumptions underlying the law of demand. We are going to study the law of diminishing marginal utility. Let me clarify and explain that this is only for high-level students. The law of diminishing marginal utility. In Spanish, this is la ley de la utilidad marginal decreciente. Okay, write it down as part of your definitions. The law of diminishing marginal utility is based on a simple theory of consumer behavior that explains the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, or the law of demand. Let's define utility. Utility is the satisfaction that consumers gain from consuming something. It is a subjective concept because satisfaction is something that depends entirely on personal tastes and preferences, which vary from person to person. Utility cannot be measured, but for the purpose of developing the theory, we have to assume that utility is quantifiable. It can be measured in terms of number of units, and the unit that we use is a util. Utils do not exist in actual fact. However, we assume they exist for the purposes of building the theory. So total utility is a total satisfaction consumers get from consuming something, while marginal utility is the extra satisfaction that consumers receive from consuming one more unit of a good. Table 2.2 shows how total utility and marginal utility are related to each other. You can see that both total utility and marginal utility are measured in utils. Table 2.2, here we have the examples of the table. And shows Anna's preferences when she buys t-shirts. The first t-shirt provides her with 15 utils of total utility. This is also her marginal utility. When she buys a second t-shirt, her total utility increases from 15 utils to 27 utils, but her marginal utility or extra satisfaction from buying the second t-shirt has fallen to 12 utils. The marginal utility of the second unit is simply the total utility of the second unit minus the total utility of the first unit, which is 27 utils minus 15 utils equals 12 utils, and so on with the extra t-shirt she buys. Her total utility increases, but her marginal utility falls. So marginal utility keeps decreasing, and at some point it may even become negative, meaning that total utility starts to fall. This pattern illustrates the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is based on the idea that the satisfaction consumers get from consuming more and more units of a good decreases. The law of diminishing marginal utility explains the law of demand. As we know, according to the law of demand, as the price of a good decreases, quantity demanded increases, ceteris paribus. The law of diminishing marginal utility shows that if the consumer derives less and less utility from each extra unit of a good consumed, then she or he will buy additional units only if the price of the good falls. So, in conclusion, according to the law of diminishing marginal utility, as consumption of a good increases, marginal utility or the extra utility the consumer receives decreases with each additional unit consumed. This underlies the law of demand, as it shows that a consumer will be willing to buy an additional unit of a good only if its price falls. So that is a condition to buy an additional unit. What about the income and substitution effects? The income and substitution effects are an alternative explanation of the law of demand. So remember that they are an alternative explanation of the law of demand. As we have seen, the law of demand shows a relationship between the price of a good and quantity of the good demanded, ceteris paribus. So any price change causes a change in quantity demanded, shown as a movement along the demand curve. We will now see that the total effect of a price change on quantity demanded can be broken down into two separate effects: the substitution effect and the income effect, with the total effect of a price change being the sum of these two effects. So let's go for the first one, the substitution effect. If the price of a good falls, the consumer substitutes, that means buy more, of the now less expensive good. Therefore, quantity demanded increases. There is always a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded as a result of the substitution effect. So as price falls, the quantity of the good demanded increases. As price increases, quantity demanded falls. The income effect. Consider again a fall in price. This means that the consumer's real income or purchasing power has increased. To understand what this means, consider the following example. Say you have $12 and you want to buy some pencils. When the price is $4 per pencil, you can buy 3 pencils. Suppose then that the price of pencil falls to $3 per pencil. You can now buy 4 pencils. The sum of money at your disposal is $12. And that hasn't changed. And yet the purchasing power of $12 or what your money can buy has increased as a result of the fall in the price of pencils. So real income is the same as purchasing power. It increases as price falls, and it decreases as price rise. Therefore, as price falls and real income increases, quantity demanded of the good increases. Once again, there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And well, important to take notes, the substitution effect and the income effect reinforce each other. A fall in price leads to an increase in quantity demanded, both because of the substitution effect and because of the income effect. In the case of most goods whose price is a small fraction of income, the substitution effect is the most important part of the explanation of the low demanded, because being a small fraction of income, the effect that a price change has on real income will be tiny. The income effect becomes important only in the case of purchases of goods whose price take up a large fraction of income. You should know that the above analysis refers to normal goods, where income and demand change in the same direction. As real income increases, consumers want to buy more of the good. If you are interested in seeing what happens in the case of inferior goods, you can read about it in the digital coursebook extra materials. Here we have some exercises. Test your understanding 2.3. This is for high level only. You can pause the video now and work on this. Okay, you can see the answers for exercises 1A, 1B, and 2. You can pause the video now and check your answers. Well, this is a glossary of Unit 2.2. We have studied words like demand, demand curve, law of demand, market demand, known price determinants of demand, normal good, inferior good, substitute goods, complementary goods, utility, law of diminishing marginal utility, substitution effect, and income effect. Thank you.